This lesson is on carbohydrates. It is the primary energy source of the human body. So carbohydrates function to give energy to the central nervous system, to our brain and spinal cord. It's the only fuel that the central nervous system could use for energy, and also the carbohydrates provide energy to the working muscles and organs of the body. So it is the primary energy source of the human body. It's very important that we eat a sufficient amount of them. Most of the foods we eat in one day should be carbohydrates. They provide the energy to the human body, and each gram of a carbohydrate will give us 4 calories. Carbohydrates has always gotten a bad rap in society where people think, oh, I need a low carbohydrate diet, or I shouldn't be eating so many carbs. But in all reality, a little bit more than half of our diet, or 60% of our diet, should be from the good type of carbohydrates. We have to make sure we're eating the right kind of carbohydrates because there's good and bad in everything. Basically, there's 2 different types of carbohydrates. There's a simple carbohydrate and a complex carbohydrate. And the one we want to be eating most of is the complex carbohydrates. First, let's start with the simple carbohydrates. And the first simple carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. It's one molecule. There's 3 different types of monosaccharide. But regardless of what type of carbohydrate we eat, the body will break everything down into the most simplest form of a carbohydrate, which is glucose. And that glucose is the energy we'll be utilizing for our energy. The second type of simple carbohydrate is called a disaccharide, and that is 2 carbohydrate molecules linked together. So there's 2 different kind of simple carbohydrates. There is the monosaccharide and the disaccharide. Simple carbohydrates are found in fruit, in dairy, and in sugar or processed type of carbohydrates. Not all simple carbohydrates are bad, as I've mentioned that we can find them naturally in fruit and in dairy, but what we want to avoid, if there was something called a bad carbohydrate, is the sugars and the processed carbohydrates that act like simple carbohydrates in the body. The best carbohydrates to eat are the complex carbohydrates, which are also called polysaccharide. A polysaccharide is 3 or more carbohydrate molecules linked together, and in some cases there's hundreds or thousands of carbohydrate molecules linked together. The complex carbohydrates, also known as polysaccharides, are the best type of carbohydrates to be eating, and these are the energy that come from particularly plants, plant-based energy. And we call these type of carbohydrates starch. The best type of carbohydrates to eat, and the ones that are listed as complex, are vegetables and those found within whole grains. So far we've learned that there's 2 types of carbohydrates, the simple and the complex. About 60% of our diet should be carbohydrates, mostly the complex ones that are found in whole grains and in vegetables. These complex carbohydrates, they will trickle into the bloodstream. Everything will be broken down into glucose, but that glucose will enter the bloodstream very slowly. So the complex carbs will give us energy for long periods of time. If all we ate was simple carbohydrates that come from fruit, sugars, dairy, or processed grains like processed white bread or processed white rice, if all we ate was the simple carbohydrates from that, the glucose enters the bloodstream really, really quickly. It rises the blood glucose dramatically, and that has impacts for future diabetes, but also for our weight control. So we have to eat the good type of carbohydrate and minimize the not so healthy type of carbohydrates, which are those simple carbohydrates. Most of our diet should be whole grains that have been unprocessed, such as oats, barley, wild rice, brown rice, whole wheat, things made from whole wheat that haven't been processed. And the second, beside whole grains, would be the vegetables. Very important to eat, with a few servings of fruit and dairy as well. When we think about carbohydrates, if we realize that vegetables and whole grains are the good type of carbohydrates, it's easy to understand how more than half of our diet should be from those healthier type of carbohydrates. And this is kind of just a review. Again, 60% of our diet should be carbohydrates because that gives the fuel to our brain, the fuel to our muscles to do the work that we need during a day. Most of that carbohydrate should be whole grains that have been unprocessed. And the next PowerPoint is going to explain to you the difference between a whole grain and a processed grain. But most of the carbohydrates should be whole grain and vegetables with a few fruits and dairy thrown in there as well. What we want to focus on is natural whole foods and kind of minimize the processed carbohydrates and minimize the sugars as much as possible. And one other thing I'd like to mention before this PowerPoint concludes is that fiber is a type of complex carbohydrate. Fiber is found in all the healthy types of complex carbs, such as whole grains, vegetables, and it's also found in fruit as well, which is why that's important to eat in our daily diet. We should have a minimum intake of about 38 grams of fiber per day, but you can have more. And that fiber is going to help us control our appetite. The fiber is going to help moderate how quickly blood glucose will rise. It's going to help us in that way, it will help us control our body fat or our adipose tissue. It's also going to prevent diseases. Fiber is known to prevent cardiovascular disease, digestive problems, cancer, and it also minimizes the chances of type 2 diabetes as well. So fiber does a lot for the human body. It also cleans out the digestive system, as you probably know, but it prevents disease and it helps maintain our weight as well. So we're aiming at minimum 38 grams per day, and where we're going to find that is in the natural whole foods, such as the whole grains, the vegetables, and the fruit.